Okay, Chapter 9. Dantes passed through all the stages of misery endured by prisoners forgotten in a dungeon. He began with pride, which is the result of hope and a consciousness of innocence. Then he began to doubt even his innocence. Finally, his pride collapsed, and he began to pray, not yet to God, but to men. He begged to be taken from his cell and put into another one, even if it should be darker and deeper. A change, even disadvantageous, would afford him a distraction of several days. He begged to be given books and to be allowed to take walks outside. None of these things was granted to him, but he continued to ask for them. Finally, having exhausted all his human resources, Dantes turned to God. He remembered the prayers his mother had taught him and found meanings in them of which he had formerly been unaware. For the happy man, prayer is only a jumble of words, until the day when sorrow comes to explain to him the sublime language by means of which he speaks to God. Despite his fervent prayers, however, he remained a prisoner. His soul became dark, and a cloud seemed to pass before his eyes. His mind was filled with a single thought, that of his happiness destroyed for no apparent reason. Then his despondency gave way to wrath. He roared blasphemies which made his jailer recoil in horror, and dashed himself furiously against the walls of his prison. The informer's letter which Villefort had shown him, which he himself had touched, came back to his mind. He seemed to see each line of it blazing forth in letters of fire. He told himself that it was the hatred of men, not the vengeance of God, which had plunged him into the abyss where he now found himself. He doomed these unknown men to all the tortures his fiery imagination could contrive, but even the cruelest ones seemed too mild and too short for them, for after the torment would come death, which would bring them, if not rest, at least the insensibility which resembles it. The thought that death brings release from suffering led him to the idea of suicide. Once he had given himself up to it, he found consolation in it. All his pain and sorrow seemed to flee from his cell at the silent approach of the angel of death. His life seemed more bearable when he reflected that he could cast it aside like a tattered garment whenever he chose. There were two ways to die. The first was to tie his handkerchief to a bar of the window and hang himself. The second was to starve himself. The first was repugnant to him. He had been raised to have a horror of pirates, men who were hanged from the yard arms of ships. Hanging was therefore something dishonorable which he could not bring himself to undergo. He chose the second alternative and swore to carry it through. "I'll throw my food out the window," he thought, "and it will look as though I've eaten it." From that day onward, twice a day, he threw his food out the small barred window, through which he could see nothing but the sky. At first gaily, then thoughtfully, then regretfully. He had formerly found his food repulsive, but now hunger made it appear appetizing to the eye and exquisite to the smell. Sometimes he would stand for over an hour staring at a piece of rotten meat or a crust of black moldy bread. But then he would remember the oath he had sworn to himself, and the fear of despising himself kept him from violating it. Finally the day came, when he no longer had the strength to stand up in order to throw away his supper. The next day he could no longer see and could scarcely hear. The jailer believed him to be seriously ill. Dantes expected death within a short time. A numbness, which was not without a certain feeling of well-being, took possession of him. The pangs in his stomach ceased. When he closed his eyes, he saw bright flashes of light. Suddenly, toward 9 o'clock at night, he heard a faint noise coming from the wall next to which he was lying. So many loathsome animals had made their noises in his cell that he had gradually become accustomed to them and did not let his sleep be disturbed by them. But this time, whether because his senses had been intensified by abstinence, because the noise was actually louder than usual, or because at that supreme moment everything took on greater importance, Dantes raised his head to listen. He heard a regular scratching sound which might be coming from either a large claw, a powerful tooth, or some sort of instrument. The sound continued for about 3 hours. Then he heard what seemed to be something crumbling, and there was silence. Okay, so the first part of this chapter is really Dante's losing all hope. No, he really lost all hope, and at first he kept thinking that he was innocent, and then later on he started to even doubt whether he was innocent or not. And then he prayed to man, he prayed to God, he got very angry, he got very sad, and he's at a point even where now he's trying na lang to starve himself. He's just trying to kill himself because he'd rather die than live there, no, than have to live in that specific prison. So he's starving himself. But now that he's almost dying, like, good guys, because of starvation, he begins to hear like a scratching noise in his prison cell. The next morning it began again. The sound of like a tool kuno, or a claw, or something sharp scratching on stone. He heard it good in his prison cell. The next morning it began again, so distinctly that he could hear it without effort. There's no doubt now, he said to himself. Since the sound goes on even in the daytime, it must be some prisoner working to escape. Oh, if I were only with him, how I'd help him. Then a dark cloud suddenly passed over the hope that had dawned in his mind. What if the sound were caused only by workmen repairing some nearby cell? It would be easy to find out by asking the jailer, but such a question might be dangerous. Unfortunately, Dantes was so weak and giddy that he was unable to think consecutively. He could think of only one way to restore his lucidity. He took the broth which the jailer had left for him and drank it. He soon felt order returning to his scattered thoughts. Okay, so he thinks, guys, that the sounds he hears in the prison cell, it's coming kuno from a prisoner who's trying to escape. Mark, that's kind of his conclusion. No nga, those sound like someone trying to escape from here. And he starts eating again. After a time, he said to himself, there's one way I can find out without the risk. I'll knock on the wall. If it's a workman, he'll stop for a moment and try to guess the cause of the sound. But then he'll go back to work. But if it's a prisoner, the sound will frighten him. He'll stop working and won't begin again until night, when he'll assume that everyone else is asleep. He stood up. This time his legs were steady and his eyes saw clearly. He went over to a corner of his cell, pulled out a stone which had been loosened by the dampness, and struck the wall. 3 times at the spot where the noise could be heard most distinctly. The noise stopped as if by magic. Dantes listened intently. The entire day passed without a renewal of the noise. It's a prisoner, said Dantes to himself, with unspeakable joy. Life came surging back to him. He did not sleep that night, but he still heard no sound from the wall. The next morning he devoured the food which the jailer brought him. He continued to listen for the noise to begin again, exasperated by the prudence of that prisoner who had not guessed that he had been distracted from his work of escape by another prisoner who was as eager to be free as he was. 3 days went by, 72 hours counted minute by minute. Then one evening, after the jailer had made his last visit, Dantes pressed his ear to the wall for the 100th time and seemed to feel an almost imperceptible vibration. He walked around his cell several times to calm himself, then returned to the same spot and put his ear to the wall again. He was no longer in doubt. Something was taking place on the other side of the wall. The prisoner had recognized the danger of his first maneuver and had adopted another in order to continue his work in greater safety. He had probably substituted the crowbar for the chisel. Encouraged by this discovery, Dantes resolved to come to the aid of the tireless worker. He pushed back his bed, behind which the work seemed to be going on, and looked around for an object which he could use as a tool. He saw nothing. He had no knife or any other sort of metal instrument. He had so often assured himself that the iron bars in the windows were solidly attached that he knew it was useless to try them again. He had only one resource: to break his earthenware pitcher and use one of the jagged fragments. He picked it up and dropped it to the floor. it flew into pieces. He chose 2 or 3 sharp fragments, hid them under his mattress, and left the others scattered on the floor. Breaking the pitcher was such a natural accident that the jailer would show no concern over it. Dantes had the whole night before him, but it was difficult to work in the darkness, and he soon felt his shapeless tool being blunted against the hard stone. He therefore pushed his bed back in place and waited for daylight. All night long he listened to the unknown prisoner carrying on his underground work. When the jailer came the next morning, Dantes told him the pitcher had slipped out of his hands and fallen to the floor. The jailer grumbled and went off to get a new pitcher without taking the trouble to remove the pieces of the old one. He returned a while later, told the prisoner to be more careful in the future, and went out. As soon as he was gone, Dantes pushed back his bed and saw that his work of the night before had been useless, for he had attacked the stone directly rather than the mortar around it. His heart pounded with joy when he discovered that he could scrape away bits of this mortar. They were extremely small bits, to be sure, but within half an hour, he had scraped off a handful of them, okay? So he broke his pitcher, and he's using the broken pieces to carve around the bricks, to carve the cement around the bricks, so that he can, if I don't know, eventually after so long, maybe loosen the wall. 3 days later, he had succeeded in removing all the mortar from around the stone. He now had to dislodge it, so it took him 3 days to remove 1 brick. He tried to do so with his fingernails, but they were insufficient for the task. The fragments of the pitcher broke when he tried to use them as levers. After an hour of vain efforts, he stood up full of anguish. Was he to be stopped right at the beginning? Would he have to wait, inert and useless, while the other prisoner did everything? Suddenly an idea occurred to him, and he smiled. Every day the jailer brought him his soup in a saucepan which had a metal handle. Dantes would have given 10 years of his life for that metal handle. That day, as usual, the jailer filled his bowl from the saucepan. After he had left, Dantes placed the bowl on the floor between the door and the table. The next time the jailer entered, he stepped on the bowl and broke it to pieces. This time Dantes was not to blame. He was wrong to leave his bowl on the floor, to be sure, but the jailer ought to have looked where he was going, so he contented himself with grumbling. Then he looked around to find something else into which he could pour the soup, but there was nothing. "Leave the saucepan," said Dantes. "You can pick it up again tomorrow." This suggestion appealed to the jailer's laziness. He would have no need to go upstairs, come back down, and then go up again. He left the saucepan. Dantes shivered with joy. After waiting an hour to make sure the jailer would not change his mind, he pushed back his bed and began to pry out the loosened stone, using the handle of the saucepan as a lever. So he got the jailer to leave the saucepan so he could use the metal handle to remove the brick after he removed the cement around the brick with the broken piece of his bowl. Oh my. An hour later, he had pulled the stone from the wall, making an excavation of more than 1.5 feet in diameter. Then, eager to take advantage of that night in which chance, or rather his own ingenuity, had placed such a precious instrument in his hands, he continued to work furiously. The next morning, the jailer placed a piece of bread on his table. "Didn't you bring me another bowl?" asked Dantes. "No, you break everything. First your pitcher, then your bowl. I leave you the saucepan and pour your soup into it." Dantes raised his eyes to heaven and clasped his hands under his blanket. That piece of metal aroused deeper gratitude in his heart than the greatest stroke of good fortune he had ever known in his former life. However, he had noticed that his work had caused the other prisoner to stop. But this was no reason to stop working. If his neighbor would not come to him, he would go to his neighbor. He worked all day without stopping. By evening, he had, thanks to his new tool, taken at least 10 handfuls of mortar and small stones from the wall. He interrupted his work when the time came for the jailer's evening visit and straightened out the twisted handle of the saucepan as best he could. He resumed his efforts after the jailer had left, but after 2 or 3 hours of labor he encountered an obstacle. He felt it with his hands and realized that he had reached a beam which ran directly across the passage he had begun. "Oh, oh," he cried out, "I prayed to you so long, and I thought you had listened to me at last. Dear God, have pity on me. Don't let me die in despair." "Who speaks of God and despair in the same breath?" said a muffled voice which seemed to come from under the earth. So Dantes all of a sudden hears someone talking to him. Dantes felt his hair stand on end, but he called out, "In the name of God, speak to me again, whoever you are." "Who are you?" asked the voice. "A wretched prisoner," answered Dantes. "How long have you been here?" "Since February 28, 1815. "What was your crime?" "I'm innocent." "Then what are you accused of?" "Of conspiring for the return of Napoleon." "What? Do you mean that Napoleon is no longer in power?" "He abdicated at Fontainebleau in 1814 and was exiled to the Isle of Elba. But how long have you been here, now not to know all that?" "Since 1811. Dantes shuddered. That man had been in prison 4 years longer than he had. "Very well, stop digging," said the voice, speaking rapidly. "At what depth is the excavation you've made?" "It's on a level with the ground." "How is it hidden?" "Behind my bed." "Has anyone ever moved your bed since you've been in prison?" "Never." "What's outside your cell?" "A corridor." "Where does the corridor lead to?" "To a courtyard." "Alas," murmured the voice. "What's the matter?" cried Dantes. "I was mistaken. The imperfection of my drawings misled me. One inaccurate line on my plan was equivalent to 15 feet in reality, and I took the wall in which you're digging for the wall of the citadel." "But you would only have reached the sea." "That's what I wanted. I intended to jump into the sea and swim to the Isle of Dom, or the Isle of Tibulen, or even to the mainland." "Would you have been able to swim that far?" "God would have given me the strength, but now all is lost." "Seal up your passage carefully, don't work anymore, and wait till you hear from me." "At least tell me who you are," okay? So Dantes says the prisoner in the prison cell next to Dantes, they found a way of communicating, no? Because Dantes was digging, trying to escape, and because this neighbor prisoner was also digging to escape, they kind of met each other, and now Dantes has a friend. He has a prison friend. "At least tell me who you are." I'm prisoner number 27. "Don't you trust me?" asked Dantes. He heard a bitter laugh. "How old are you? Your voice seems to be that of a young man." "I don't know my age because I haven't measured the time since I came here. All I know is that I was 19 when I was arrested in 1815. "Not quite 26, murmured the voice. "Well, a man isn't yet a traitor at that age." "Oh no," cried Dantes. "I'd let them cut me to pieces before I'd betray you." "Your age reassures me. I'll come to you. Wait for me." "When will you come?" "Let me calculate the risks. I'll give you a signal." "But you won't abandon me, will you? We'll escape together, or if we can't escape, we'll talk together. If you're young, I'll be your comrade. If you're old, I'll be your son." "Very well," said the voice. "Until tomorrow, then." Dantes stood up, placed the stone back in the wall, and pushed his bed in front of it. From that moment on, he gave himself up completely to his new happiness. He was no longer going to be alone, and he might even be free. That night, he thought the other prisoner would take advantage of the silence and the darkness to renew his conversation with him, but he was mistaken. He heard nothing all night long. The next morning, however, after the jailer's visit, he heard 3 knocks on the wall. "Is it you?" he asked. "Here I am." "Has your jailer gone?" asked the voice. "Yes, he won't come back until this evening. We have 12 hours of freedom." A moment later, Dantes heard the sound of a mass of stones and earth falling, and a hole appeared in the bottom of the passage he had begun to dig. Then he saw a head emerge through this hole, and soon a man had climbed up out of it and into his cell. So the ground moved, no, and a brick moved, and then a man crawled into Dantes's cell. cell. And Dantes has a friend. Is he gonna be a friend or is he gonna be an enemy? Read on to find out.